It was late afternoon in New York City, the kind of day when the sun hung low, casting golden light across the glass towers, and the streets buzzed with the rhythm of life. Ethan Moore, one of the wealthiest men in the city, was not someone who often found himself walking through the crowded streets. His life was typically defined by luxury, chauffeurs, private elevators, exclusive lounges. But today, something was different. He had canceled his usual schedule, feeling an odd restlessness that he couldn't quite explain. As he turned a corner near Central Park, something caught his eye. In the shadow of a grand hotel, a small figure huddled against the wall. It was a girl, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in dirty clothes, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her face was hidden beneath a tangled mess of hair, but there was something about her that made him stop. Ethan's life had always been about control, about having the answer to every problem. But in this moment, he hesitated. He knew that New York was filled with people in need, and he had always thought his money could solve any issue through donations or charities. But this was different. This was a child, alone, lost in a city that didn't care. He approached slowly, the clack of his leather shoes on the pavement startling her. She looked up, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a quiet plea in her gaze, but also a guarded wariness, like she had seen the worst of the world and knew better than to trust easily. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than he expected. She didn't respond, her eyes darting from him to the busy street behind him. He crouched down, his tailored suit feeling out of place on the cold, hard ground. "You shouldn't be out here alone. It's not safe." Again, silence. But Ethan was persistent. "Where are your parents?" Still no answer. He sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair, unsure of what to do next. The truth was, Ethan wasn't used to feeling powerless. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, who controlled every aspect of his life. Yet here he was, standing in front of a child who wouldn't even speak to him. But there was something in the way she looked at him, something that reminded him of himself, of the boy he had been long before the wealth, the fame, the success. He had been abandoned too. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be overlooked. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly, pulling off his coat and holding it out to her. "You must be cold." The girl hesitated for a moment, her small hands trembling as she reached out and took the coat, wrapping it around herself like a shield. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just pity. It was something deeper. He couldn't leave her here, not like this. "Let me help you," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "You don't have to stay here." She looked at his hand as if it were something foreign, something she hadn't seen in a long time, kindness. And then, slowly, she reached up and placed her small, dirt-stained hand in his. The moment her fingers touched his, something shifted. Ethan knew, right then and there, that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. They walked together, silently at first, the chaos of the city fading into the background as they made their way toward his car. Ethan's mind raced. What was he going to do with her? He didn't even know her name, but none of that mattered now. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her behind, not after seeing the fear and exhaustion in her eyes. As they drove toward his penthouse, Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her expression unreadable. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but her thoughts seemed far away. He wanted to ask her more questions, to understand what had brought her to that street corner, but something told him it wasn't the time. She needed space. When they arrived at his building, the doorman raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Ethan escorted the girl inside. The luxurious lobby, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, was a stark contrast to the world she had just left behind. She stood there, looking small and fragile, like she didn't belong. Ethan could sense her unease, but he gently guided her to the private elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, he finally spoke. "I don't know what your story is," he said quietly, "but you're safe here. No one will hurt you." The elevator ride was silent, but the tension between them was palpable. Ethan felt like he was standing on the edge of something, about to step into a new reality he wasn't prepared for. When the doors slid open, They entered his penthouse, a sprawling space filled with expensive art, designer furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. The girl paused, her eyes widening as she took in her surroundings. Ethan watched her, wondering what she was thinking. Did she feel overwhelmed? Was she afraid? He didn't know. But he had made a decision, one he couldn't turn back from now. "This is your home, for as long as you need," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." For the first time since they met, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan paused, unsure how to answer. Why was he helping her? Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was compassion, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain yet. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he said finally. The girl's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a glimmer of trust. He knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Ethan, who was accustomed to waking up to the hum of city life far below, found the silence almost unsettling. He rose from his bed, pulling on a robe as he made his way toward the kitchen. His thoughts immediately went to the girl. She hadn't spoken much after arriving, only responding with nods and quiet glances. He wondered if she had eaten, slept, or even ventured out of the room he had prepared for her. A guest room, designed with comfort in mind, but likely worlds apart from anything she had known before. As Ethan entered the expansive kitchen, his chef had already started preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but something felt off. Ethan's mind was elsewhere, thinking of the girl. He was just about to ask the chef if he'd seen her when a soft, hesitant shuffle reached his ears. Ethan turned to find her standing in the doorway, barefoot, her small figure barely framed against the towering marble and stainless steel appliances. She was still wearing the clothes from the day before, though she had at least washed her face, and her hair was less tangled, hanging loosely around her shoulders. "Good morning," Ethan said, offering her a gentle smile. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, but didn't move. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, clearly uncomfortable in the vast space. Ethan noticed how her gaze lingered on the polished floors and high ceilings, as though she couldn't quite believe she was actually there. He gestured to the table, a sleek glass design with plush chairs. "Come on, sit. You can eat whatever you want." She hesitated, then slowly made her way to the table, sitting on the very edge of the chair as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. Ethan poured her a glass of orange juice, setting it in front of her. "What's your name?" he asked casually, hoping to ease into the conversation. For a moment, she stared at the glass, tracing her fingers along its rim. Then, finally, she spoke in a soft, almost broken whisper. "Lily." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Lily," he repeated, testing the name out on his tongue. "That's a beautiful name." She didn't respond, keeping her eyes down as the chef placed a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon in front of her. She stared at the food like it was foreign, as if the idea of a warm, fresh meal was something she hadn't seen in a long time. Ethan watched her cautiously take a bite, still too tense to relax fully. "You don't have to be scared, you know," he said, trying to reassure her. "I told you, you're safe here." Lily looked up at him, her expression unreadable, then quickly focused back on her food, chewing slowly. Ethan could tell she wasn't ready to trust him yet. He wasn't even sure how much he could do to earn that trust, but he was determined to try. Over the next few days, Lily's presence in the penthouse was like a shadow. She moved silently, staying mostly in the guest room or sitting by the large windows, staring out at the city skyline. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in one or two words, never giving more than absolutely necessary. Ethan had left her new clothes in her room, but she hadn't touched them, continuing to wear the same ragged outfit she arrived in. Ethan began to notice small things, though, small cracks in her guarded exterior. Once, when she didn't think he was watching, she had picked up a picture frame from the shelf, staring at the photo of him and his parents from years ago. He couldn't imagine what must be going through her mind, being in such a drastically different world from the one she came from. Then there was the night she woke up screaming. It was late, well past midnight, and Ethan had been asleep for hours when the sound jolted him awake. The scream echoed through the penthouse, filled with pure terror. He rushed out of his room, heart pounding, following the sound to Lily's door. He found her curled up in the corner of her bed, trembling, her eyes wide open but distant, as if she were seeing something far worse than the shadows of the room. "Lily," he called, kneeling beside her. "Lily, it's okay. It's just a dream." But she didn't respond. She kept shaking, mumbling something incoherent under her breath, her whole body racked with fear. Ethan hesitated for a moment before carefully reaching out to touch her shoulder, hoping it would snap her out of the nightmare. "It's all right," he whispered. "You're safe. You're here with me." Slowly, the trembling subsided, though her eyes were still wide with panic. She blinked a few times, coming back to the present, but her breathing was erratic, and tears stained her cheeks. Ethan didn't know what to say, how to make it better, so he did the only thing he could think of. He sat beside her, keeping his hand gently on her shoulder until she calmed down. For a long time, they sat there in silence. The only sound in the room was the distant hum of the city below. Finally, when she seemed to regain her composure, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice small and hoarse. "I'm sorry." Ethan frowned, shaking his head. "You don't have to apologize." Lily's gaze dropped, her fingers gripping the blanket tightly. I don't sleep well. I have nightmares." Ethan could see that this was more than just a bad dream. There was real trauma there, buried deep, and he realized in that moment that whatever she had gone through was far worse than he had initially thought. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Ethan said gently, not wanting to push her. "But whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to decide if he meant it. For the first time, she looked like she was considering letting him in, letting down that wall of silence and fear. But before she could say anything, she quickly wiped her face again, as if embarrassed by her vulnerability. "I'm fine," she muttered, curling back into the bed. "It's nothing." Ethan knew it wasn't nothing, but he didn't press. Instead, he stood up slowly. "All right, try to get some rest. I'll leave the door open, just in case." Lily nodded, but didn't look at him as he left the room, the door softly clicking behind him. As Ethan walked back to his own room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only scratching the surface of what this girl had been through. He thought back to his own childhood, the loneliness, the abandonment, but even his worst memories didn't seem to compare to the weight of what she was carrying. And he knew that if he was going to help her, it was going to take time. Time, patience, and a level of care he hadn't realized he was capable of. This wasn't just about providing shelter anymore. It was about healing, for both of them. The days passed slowly after that night. Ethan tried to give Lily her space, but her silence weighed heavily on him. He found himself checking in on her more often than he intended. Small glances when she wandered through the penthouse, or subtle questions during meals that rarely elicited more than a one-word response. Yet, even without her speaking much, he noticed subtle changes. Lily was still quiet, but she seemed more alert, less trapped in her own thoughts. She began to explore the penthouse more freely, venturing out of her room and into the wide-open living spaces. Ethan watched her from a distance, letting her move at her own pace. He understood the delicacy of the situation. Trust, he knew, could not be rushed. One evening, as the sun set over the city, casting an orange glow through the massive windows, Ethan found Lily standing by the glass, staring out at the cityscape. Her small frame seemed even more fragile against the vastness of the skyline. She hadn't noticed him approach, so he paused for a moment, watching her. There was something about the way she stood, her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight, that made him feel a deep ache in his chest. "You like the view?" he asked, stepping closer. His voice was calm, careful not to startle her. Lily glanced at him, then back at the city below. "It's big," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, coming to stand beside her. "Yeah, it is. Makes you feel small sometimes, doesn't it?" Lily didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the streets far below, where the headlights of cars stretched into a never-ending stream of light. "I used to live near here," she said after a moment, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. Ethan turned to look at her, surprised. It was the first time she had volunteered anything about her past. "Really?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle, trying not to break the fragile moment. "Where?" Lily shrugged, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "I don't know exactly. We moved around a lot. Sometimes we'd stay in shelters. Other times, we just stayed wherever we could." Ethan's heart sank. He knew life had been hard for her, but hearing it in her own words made it more real. The streets, the shelters, the constant uncertainty, that was the life she had known. A far cry from the luxury and security of his world. He tried to imagine what it must have been like for her, to never know where she'd sleep or when her next meal would come. It was a reality so far removed from his own that it almost felt unreal. "Do you remember when you were last with someone? Before I found you?" Ethan asked carefully. Lily shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms over her chest. "My mom," she said quietly. "But she left." Ethan stayed silent, letting her talk at her own pace. "We were together for a while," Lily continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But she just left one day. I waited for her, but she didn't come back." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He knew what abandonment felt like, but hearing it from a child, so raw, so simple, yet so devastating, hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she deserved better. But the words caught in his throat. "Do you think she'll come back?" Lily asked, turning to face him for the first time since she started speaking. Ethan met her eyes, seeing the hope mixed with doubt in her gaze. He wanted to tell her the truth, but the truth was too cruel. Instead, he knelt down beside her, putting a hand on her arm. "I don't know, Lily," he said softly, "but I do know that you don't have to be alone anymore." Lily stared at him for a moment, searching his face for something. Reassurance, comfort, maybe even trust. Finally, she nodded, though the sadness in her eyes remained. Ethan could tell that, even if she didn't believe it fully yet, she wanted to. That night, Ethan found it hard to sleep. Lily's words echoed in his mind. The image of a child waiting for someone who would never return. It bothered him in a way he couldn't shake. He had to do something more for her. Providing her with a roof and food wasn't enough. She needed more than physical care. She needed stability, safety, and above all, someone who wouldn't leave. The next day, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. After breakfast, he sat across from Lily at the kitchen table, his expression serious but kind. "Lily," he started, "I've been thinking, how would you feel about talking to someone? A professional, I mean. Someone who can help you with everything you've been through." Lily stiffened, her fork frozen mid-air. "You mean like a shrink?" she asked, her tone wary. Ethan smiled, though he could tell she wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea. "Not like that. More like someone you can talk to. Someone who can help you make sense of things." Lily frowned, setting her fork down. "I don't need that. I'm fine." Ethan leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze. "I know you're strong, Lily. I can see that. But being strong doesn't mean you have to handle everything by yourself. You've been through a lot. More than anyone your age should have to. Talking about it might help." She didn't respond, her eyes flickering to the window as if searching for an escape. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew pushing her too hard would only drive her further into her shell, but he also knew she needed help. "Just think about it, okay?" he said finally, his voice gentle. "No pressure. It's up to you." Lily didn't say anything, but she gave a small nod before returning her focus to her food. Ethan let the conversation drop, knowing it wasn't a decision she could make right away. But at least the seed was planted. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Ethan was sitting in his office, going over some paperwork, when he heard a knock on the door. He looked up to see Lily standing there, looking nervous. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Ethan set his papers aside, surprised by the request. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lily stepped into the room, her small figure dwarfed by the large, mahogany desk and the towering bookshelves lining the walls. She hesitated, as if trying to gather the courage to speak, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt, "about what you said, about talking to someone." Ethan's eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He could see how hard this was for her. "I don't know if it'll help," she continued, her voice uncertain, "but maybe I'll try." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. It was a small step, but it was progress. He gave her a reassuring smile. "That's all I'm asking, Lily. Just give it a try. We'll take it one step at a time." For the first time since she arrived, Ethan felt like he was seeing a glimmer of hope in Lily's eyes. The silence between them, the walls she had built around herself, were starting to crack. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like they were walking it together. As she turned to leave, Lily paused at the door, glancing back at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "Anytime, Lily. Anytime." Lily's decision to talk to someone felt like a breakthrough, a small but significant victory in Ethan's eyes. Over the next few days, he made arrangements to connect her with a therapist who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. He was careful in his approach, making sure that she didn't feel pressured or overwhelmed. He reassured her that it wasn't mandatory, that she could stop at any time. And for the first time, Lily seemed to consider the possibility that she might not have to carry her burdens alone. On the morning of her first session, Ethan noticed a shift in her demeanor. She was quieter than usual, barely touching her breakfast and avoiding eye contact. He knew she was nervous, and he didn't push her to talk about it. He simply reminded her that he'd be right there when she got back. The therapist, Dr. Harper, was a soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed to put Lily at ease when they first met. Ethan waited outside the office, pacing the hallway, his nerves on edge. He didn't know what to expect from this session, but he hoped it would be the start of something positive. After what felt like an eternity, the door to Dr. Harper's office opened, and Lily emerged, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. Ethan stood up immediately, searching her face for any sign of how the session had gone. "How did it go?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, not wanting to overwhelm her. Lily shrugged, but there was a small, almost imperceptible shift in her eyes. "It was okay. She's nice." Ethan smiled, relieved. "That's good. If you want to talk about it, I don't," Lily interrupted quickly, her tone firm but not harsh. "Not yet." Ethan nodded, understanding. "Whenever you're ready." As they drove back to the penthouse, Ethan couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of Lily finding her way out of the darkness that had consumed her. Maybe, just maybe, she would begin to trust him more. But as the days passed, something began to change. It was subtle at first, small shifts in Lily's behavior that Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on. She was quieter than usual, more withdrawn, but not in the way she had been when she first arrived. This was different. It was as if something was gnawing at her from the inside, something she wasn't ready to share. One evening, a few days after her session with Dr. Harper, Ethan found her sitting by the large windows again, staring out at the city. He had come to recognize this as her retreat when she needed space, but tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. "Lily," he called softly from the doorway. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the skyline. Ethan approached her slowly, taking a seat in the chair next to hers. He could see the reflection of the city lights dancing in her eyes, but there was no light in them, just a deep, troubling silence. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice careful. For a long moment, Lily didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you ever feel like something bad is going to happen?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lily shrugged, her eyes still glued to the window. "I don't know. It's just this feeling. Like something's coming, and I can't stop it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard this kind of talk before, from people who had been through things no child should ever experience. It was the weight of trauma, the constant fear that the worst was yet to come, even when everything seemed calm on the surface. "You're safe here, Lily," Ethan said softly. "Nothing bad is going to happen to you." Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. as if she wanted to believe him but couldn't. "I don't know. I don't think I can escape it." Ethan's mind raced, trying to understand what she was feeling. He wondered if the therapy session had stirred up old memories, if it had brought something to the surface that she wasn't ready to face yet. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. "About what you're feeling?" Lily shook her head, her expression tightening. "I don't even know what it is." Ethan leaned back in his chair, unsure of what to say. He wanted to fix it, to take away her fear, but he knew this wasn't something he could solve with a few comforting words. Whatever she was dealing with, it was bigger than him. The next day, Ethan noticed more unsettling signs. Lily, who had always kept to herself but had at least tried to engage in small ways, now seemed to avoid him altogether. She would retreat to her room for hours, the door closed, the lights dimmed. When he tried to check on her, she would give vague, distracted answers, her eyes distant. One evening, after another tense and quiet dinner, Ethan found himself standing outside her room, his hand poised to knock. He hesitated, unsure of whether he should push her to open up or give her space. Before he could make a decision, he heard something from the other side of the door, a soft, muffled sound. He pressed his ear closer, straining to hear. It was crying, quiet, restrained sobs, as if she was trying to hold them in but couldn't anymore. Ethan's heart clenched. He knew that pain all too well, the kind of pain that made you feel like you were drowning but didn't want anyone to see it. He knocked gently on the door. "Lily, can I come in?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. There was a long pause before she answered, her voice shaky. "I'm fine." Ethan stood there, his hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't believe her. He couldn't just leave her like this, but he also didn't want to force his way in. "Lily," he said softly, "you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, finally, the door creaked open a few inches. Lily stood there, her eyes red and swollen, tears still clinging to her lashes. She looked fragile, more vulnerable than Ethan had ever seen her. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared all the time. It won't stop." Ethan felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to be scared, Lily. You've been through a lot, but you don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you." Lily's bottom lip trembled, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might pull away, retreat back into her shell. But then, to his surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Her small frame shook with quiet sobs, and Ethan held her, feeling the weight of her pain. They stood like that for a long time, the city lights casting a soft glow into the room. Ethan didn't say anything, knowing that words wouldn't fix what was broken inside her. He just held her, hoping that somehow, his presence could offer some comfort. Eventually, Lily pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked exhausted, but there was a small glimmer of relief in her eyes, as if letting go of some of the pain had lifted a tiny piece of the burden she carried. "I'll try again," she whispered. "With Dr. Harper. Maybe it'll help." Ethan smiled, his heart aching with pride for her bravery. "I think that's a good idea. One step at a time, right?" Lily nodded, her eyes still red but more focused now. "Yeah, one step at a time." As she turned to go back to her room, Ethan felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, hope, and a lingering fear that the battle was far from over. He knew they were making progress, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking beneath the surface, something Lily hadn't yet shared. And whatever it was, Ethan was determined to face it with her, no matter how long it took. The next few weeks marked a turning point, but not in the way Ethan had hoped. Lily attended her therapy sessions with Dr. Harper, and while she seemed to be making some progress, the weight that hung over her remained. There were moments of light, occasional smiles during dinner, brief conversations that felt more natural, but they were fleeting, overshadowed by the darkness that still clung to her. Ethan did everything he could to create a stable environment for Lily. He made sure she had everything she needed: from a structured routine to small moments of freedom where she could just be a kid again. He encouraged her to explore the city, offering to take her on trips to Central Park or the museum, trying to show her that the world could still be a place of beauty and wonder. But despite his best efforts, something continued to gnaw at Lily. It was as if there was a storm brewing inside her, a battle she was fighting alone. Ethan could feel it, could see the tension in her face, in the way her eyes darted nervously around the room when she thought no one was watching. Then came the nightmares. It started with small disturbances, Lily waking up in the middle of the night, calling out in her sleep, but quickly falling back to rest. Ethan would hear her through the walls, but he didn't want to invade her privacy, so he let her be. However, as the days passed, the dreams became more frequent, more intense. Her screams would echo through the penthouse, filling the silence with terror. One night, it became too much. Ethan was jolted awake by the sound of Lily's voice, not just a scream, but desperate, pleading words. "No, please, don't leave me." He rushed to her room, his heart racing. When he opened the door, he found Lily thrashing in her bed, trapped in the grip of a nightmare. Her face was twisted in fear, her body drenched in sweat. She called out again, her voice cracking, and Ethan's chest tightened. "Lily," he said softly, approaching the bed. "Lily, wake up." She didn't respond, still lost in whatever horrors her mind was conjuring. Ethan gently shook her shoulder. "Lily, it's just a dream. Wake up." Her eyes shot open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize where she was. She looked around the room, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, until her eyes finally settled on Ethan. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to wake you." Ethan knelt beside her bed, his face full of concern. "Don't apologize. Do you want to talk about it?" Lily shook her head, her body still trembling. "It was just a bad dream. That's all." Ethan knew it was more than just a bad dream, but he didn't press her. He had learned by now that pushing too hard only made her retreat further. He sat there with her in silence, waiting for her breathing to calm. "Can I stay here for a while?" she asked quietly, her voice small, vulnerable. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Of course." He sat at the edge of her bed, watching as her breathing slowly evened out, her body relaxing under the blanket. But even as she drifted back to sleep, Ethan's mind raced. He had hoped the therapy would help, but it was clear that whatever haunted Lily was far deeper than he had realized. She had never told him the full story of what had happened before he found her, and now, he wondered if she ever would. In the days that followed, Ethan noticed a new pattern. Lily became more withdrawn again, spending hours locked away in her room or staring out the window. The small moments of joy and connection they had shared started to disappear, replaced by an uneasy tension. Ethan tried to engage her, but it felt like there was a wall between them, one that was growing thicker by the day. One afternoon, while Ethan was in his office going over some business emails, the housekeeper knocked on his door. She looked uncomfortable, shifting on her feet as if unsure of whether to speak. "Mr. Moore," she began cautiously, "there's something I think you should know about." Ethan frowned, setting his phone down. "What is it?" "It's the girl, Lily," she said, her voice low. "I've noticed some odd behavior lately. She's been taking things from the house. Small things, nothing valuable, but I've found them hidden in her room. Jewelry, silverware, even some of the books from the library." Ethan's mind raced as the words sank in. "Are you sure?" The housekeeper nodded. "I didn't want to say anything at first, but it's been happening more often. I think she might be hoarding them." Ethan's stomach twisted. He couldn't imagine why Lily would do something like that, but the idea of her hoarding items, especially things that didn't belong to her, worried him. It was a sign that something was very wrong. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice tight. "I'll talk to her." That evening, after dinner, Ethan found Lily sitting by the windows again, her knees pulled up to her chest as she stared out at the city. He approached her carefully, taking a seat beside her. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the tension in the air. "Lily," he began gently, "I need to ask you something. Have you been taking things from around the house? Lily stiffened immediately, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't answer, but the guilt in her eyes was enough. Why? Ethan asked softly, trying to keep his voice calm. You don't have to steal, Lily. Anything you need, you can ask for. She bit her lip, her shoulders tensing as if preparing for a scolding. But Ethan didn't raise his voice. He waited patiently, giving her time to respond. I don't know, she finally muttered, her voice barely audible. I needed to. Needed to? Ethan repeated, confused. Why? Lily shifted uncomfortably, hugging her knees tighter. Because if I have them, I know they can't take them away. No one can take anything from me if I already have it. Ethan's heart sank as he realized what she meant. It wasn't about the items themselves, it was about control. In her mind, taking those things gave her some small measure of security in a world that had always felt unstable, unreliable. It was her way of protecting herself from being abandoned again. No one's going to take anything from you, Ethan said softly. You don't have to do this, Lily. You're safe here. No one's going to leave you. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let herself cry. You don't know that, she whispered. Everyone leaves. No matter what they say, they always leave. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that not everyone left, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. All he could do was try to show her, day by day, that he wasn't going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you, Lily, he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. I don't care what happens. I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, Lily looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she got up from the window and disappeared into her room, leaving Ethan sitting there alone, his heart heavy with the weight of her pain. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Lily's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, everyone leaves. Asterisk, there was a darkness in her past that he hadn't uncovered yet, something that was holding her back, keeping her trapped in the fear of being abandoned. And as much as Ethan wanted to believe he could protect her from that, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to her before was far from over. The storm wasn't just inside her anymore. It was coming. Ethan's nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by images of Lily's broken expression and the ominous weight of her words. Everyone leaves. He couldn't stop thinking about her nightmares, the hoarding, the fear that gripped her every time she believed someone might be taken away from her. No matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to reassure her, it seemed like Lily was slipping further into her own private world of pain. One rainy afternoon, as the dark clouds rolled over the city, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. He was tired, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him, but more than anything, he wanted to check on Lily. The house was quiet when he entered, an unsettling silence filling the usually warm space. He called out for her, but there was no answer. His footsteps echoed as he moved through the penthouse, checking her room first. The door was open, the bed neatly made, but Lily wasn't there. A small ripple of panic began to form in his chest. He checked the kitchen, the living room, even the study where she sometimes sat with a book, but she was nowhere to be found. The panic deepened. Ethan's mind raced as he thought of the worst possibilities. Had she run away? Was she outside, wandering the city alone again? And then, he noticed something. The faint sound of movement coming from one of the guest rooms, the one no one ever used. The door was closed, but there was a soft shuffling noise behind it. Ethan's stomach twisted as he approached, his heart pounding harder with each step. He slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside, Lily was crouched in the corner, her back to the door. The room was dimly lit, the rain tapping lightly against the window, casting a grayish glow over everything. She was holding something in her hands, and as Ethan stepped closer, he realized it was a small box, a wooden jewelry box that belonged to his late mother. Lily didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his presence, but Ethan could see her shoulders trembling. He knew what this was. The hoarding, the taking. It wasn't about stealing. It was about holding on to something, anything, that she felt wouldn't be taken away from her. Lily, Ethan said softly, stepping further into the room. What are you doing?" She didn't respond, her fingers tracing the edges of the box as if she was lost in another world, disconnected from the present. Ethan could see her hands shaking, the tension in her entire body growing more and more unbearable with each passing second. "Lily, it's okay," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this." Finally, she turned to look at him, her eyes wide with fear and something else, something darker. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as if she was holding back tears. "I don't want to lose it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't lose it." Ethan crouched down in front of her, his heart breaking at the sight of her. "You're not going to lose anything, Lily. You don't have to hold on so tightly. You're safe here." But Lily shook her head, her fingers clutching the box even tighter. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with panic. "You don't understand. They always leave. Everything gets taken away." Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. This wasn't just about the box. This was about everything. Her past, her mother, the endless cycle of abandonment and loss that had shaped her entire life. He wanted to reach out, to pull her out of that place, but he knew he had to tread carefully. "I'm here, Lily," he said softly, his voice calm. "I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, her eyes met his, and he saw the fear, the desperation in them. She wanted to believe him. He could see it. But there was something else in her gaze, something that told him this was about more than just her fear of losing people. This was about her mother, about the person who had left her behind. "Where is she?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice trembling. "Where's my mom?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, but he hadn't known how or when it would come. He had searched for answers about Lily's mother, but everything he found had been dead ends. The last trace of her mother was from a year ago, when she had checked into a shelter and then vanished. No one had seen or heard from her since. "I don't know," Ethan said gently, his voice laced with sorrow. "I've been trying to find her, but she's not coming back, is she?" Lily's voice broke, her eyes filling with tears. "She left me, just like everyone else." Ethan's chest tightened, the helplessness rising in him like a wave. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her mother hadn't abandoned her, but the truth was too hard to ignore. He couldn't lie to her, not about this. "I don't know why she left, Lily," Ethan said softly, moving closer to her. "But that doesn't mean you have to go through this alone. You have me. I'm here." Lily's tears spilled over, her hands still gripping the jewelry box tightly as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't understand. I can't trust that. I can't trust anyone. They always leave. My mom, she promised she'd come back. She promised, and she didn't." Ethan felt a surge of anger toward the woman who had done this to her, who had made her feel so unworthy, so abandoned. He didn't know what kind of life Lily's mother had led, but whatever her reasons, she had left a scar on this child that might never heal. He reached out, gently taking the box from Lily's hands. At first, she resisted, her fingers tightening around it, but after a moment, she let go. Ethan set the box aside, placing it carefully on the floor. Then, without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug. Lily froze for a second, her body rigid against his, but then she collapsed into him, her sobs shaking both of them. She cried, deep and hard, all the pain and fear she had been holding and finally pouring out. Ethan held her, his own heart breaking as he felt the depth of her despair. "I'm not leaving," he whispered into her hair. "I'm not going anywhere, Lily. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For a long time, they stayed like that, the sound of her crying filling the room as the rain continued to patter softly against the window. Ethan didn't know how long they stayed there, but it felt like time stopped. All that mattered was holding on to her, letting her know that she wasn't alone. Eventually, Lily's sobs quieted, and she pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her face was red and swollen from crying, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. A small glimmer of trust. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if you leave too?" Ethan's heart ached as he looked at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He wanted to promise her that he would never leave, that he would be there for her forever. But he knew that life was unpredictable, and he couldn't make guarantees. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I promise you this, I'm not going anywhere right now. I'll be here for as long as you need me." Lily stared at him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, slowly, she nodded, the smallest flicker of hope breaking through the darkness. Ethan helped her stand, and they walked back into the living room, the storm outside finally beginning to calm. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.